So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for lunch, and I'm delighted that we'll have a conversation with Amanda Lang, reflecting on the broader framework of Canada's future in U.S. relations, with some of the points that were raised this morning, and then we're waiting for our last panel on what's next and the political approaches to take. So Amanda Lang needs probably very little introduction to this audience or most Canadian audiences. She's one of Canada's most distinguished journalists. I think began in print, Globe and Mail and so on, then moved to television, CNN and Bloomberg, the CBC, a woman who's thought and interviewed literally hundreds and hundreds of people about the issue of how to deal with the United States and productivity and the many, many issues that we dealt with today. She has a special place in my heart because she's a Manitoban. I went to the University of Manitoba at St. Mary's Academy, where my sister-in-law taught. So always happy to welcome Manitobans to Massey College. So I think that in mentioning Manitoba, I heard Amanda, who came to a University of Manitoba event just a day or two after Donald Trump was elected. And she had a very interesting set of comments and a discussion and a conversation much like this on her thoughts about how best to approach the incoming president, now president as of a few moments ago. And Amanda, your advice then, I want to begin with this, your advice then, which I thought was sound, and it was in fact brought up again today, which was not to overreact initially. Don't be Pollyannish, but don't be frantic. That see what he is actually going to do as opposed to the tweets and the things that come out. Now, it's now been a couple months since you made what I thought were those wise comments, and we now have the new president, not a hypothetical new president. So what do you think now? Would you give the same kind of advice? What should be the tenor as we now deal with the Donald Trump in power?
It's really interesting timing to be having this conversation, because then and now, I think what all of us are experiencing is this battle between our amygdala and our prefrontal cortex. Yeah. And at the moment, my amygdala is in charge, so give me a second. Yeah. And I will say, and I'm particularly delighted to be talking to somebody of your kind of historical perspective on these things, because that's what we need right now. I felt from the beginning of my knowledge of Donald Trump, which is of course now, like all of us, decades and decades old, but as a serious politician, 8 years old, I never believed he would win the first time. I felt that it's really important to stay grounded in what we know to be true, and not get caught up in the emotions, because one of his savant-like capabilities is to stir emotion. The trouble with Donald Trump, and Tom, as somebody who understands how policy gets made, you listen to something like an inaugural address, which historically is rousing and patriotic and visionary. There's a kind of a protocol among leaders that we don't criticize the last guy for a period of time. He did it on day one in the most egregious fashion. It's, to me, though, the thing that really that stirs the emotion is an inconsistency in the man. Because on the one hand, America is a horrible place. It must be a horrible place, because he has to make it great again, and he has to restore freedom. Oh my God, their freedom has been removed. And he has to restore rights and opportunity and growth and wealth. And on the other hand, of course, as we know, every single data point at our disposal says the opposite. America is doing fantastically well. And that's either in comparison to other nations or stand on its own face. It's doing fantastically. It's never been better to be an American, even a poor American. It's just a great time in American history for wealth creation and knowledge creation and innovate on every measure. And yet, here's this man who says we're doing terribly. Here's somebody who says he wants his legacy to be a unifier and a peacemaker but they're going to take back the Panama Canal, and they're going to plant the flag on New Horizons, and they're going to, and this is a bit of a chilling one, tell me what you thought of what goes through your mind when you hear somebody like this say, expand our territory? What does that mean, and what do you think we should do with it? I'm still saying let's be calm. Let's be calm. If you're in Panama, you're probably not calm, but we're going to be calm. What do you do with an expand your territory remark?
Well, one of the difficulties is that Trump is not a well-read man, and I don't think he goes back into history very much. So when he starts using historical examples and analogies, it gets me really worried, because that's what's in his mind, and the context is not whole. So on that phrase of plant the flag, what has worried me lately is that the president he has been referencing is President William McKinley. Now, McKinley was a Republican at the height of the high tariff Republican years. And with his predecessor, Sir John A. had to deal with a tariff regime led by the Republican Party. Tariffs at the time of McKinley were about 50%, 48%, if I remember my history correct, but gargantuan. And so MacDonald and Canadian leaders had to deal with that. We may go back to that. But at the same time as McKinley used tariffs in this massive way to protect American industry, he was also expanding the American empire. He invaded Cuba. He invaded the Philippines. The two went hand in hand, this stronger America through protectionism, but American power, not just in the region, Monroe Doctrine, but across the ocean in Asia. So it worries me with him if that's the historical figure he's now striving for. Yeah. And he said that under McKinley, and that's when America was the richest, and I'm going to bring that back. So, I mean, what's happened, somebody on Fox News has mentioned McKinley, or one of the, the Heritage Foundation had sent a clipping about we should be the new, McKinleys, and he's said, oh, well, that sounds good. Yeah. So therefore, that is a problem because he's got it in his mind. And then just secondly, and we'll go back and forth on this, unlike the first term, he's got very few constraints. We talked in one of the first panels that there still was the Congress to deal with and so on. Well, he's got the Supreme Court, he's got the Senate, he's got the House of Representatives. He's not running for election again, so he doesn't have to worry about that. There has never been a president with so fewer restraints on him, let alone restraints of character and morality.
But how did you enjoy the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
Yeah.
I want to actually stay with this point that you're making, because I think this is a really important one for our leaders, and that includes business leaders. How you respond to somebody unpredictable, of course. So one argument is you wait for the thing to happen. You don't actually preemptively send a list of our targeted tariffs to the U.S. You wait for them to actually take action. You can do the work behind closed doors. What I was commenting on in the first days of his presidency was what I thought as an overreaction politically. And people like Jamie will weigh in with a more learned view on that. And you I'm sure have a more learned. But to me, it just seemed a little unseemly that all of our political leadership danced up and down to the tune of this this person who we know is unpredictable. Having said that, you've hit on something really important, I think, which is that underlying these cast-off phrases of his and these sort of bizarre. Imagine saying you're going to seize back an infrastructure asset like the Panama Canal. It almost boggles the mind. Underlying that are real policies by real people. Project 2025, which got a little bit of press and stirred up a lot of discomfort. I read it cover to cover because I wanted to know, what is this thing and what are we worried about? It's 900 pages. It's not actually that terrifying a document. It's quite a reasonable document. It's written from a very deeply conservative point of view. And from that ethos, it has a worldview, and it's a unified one. It makes sense. I actually read it and thought, I wish the Democrats would come up with a similar worldview document that was so coherent and something that you could put in front of people. Donald Trump will take tiny little bits and pieces out of this thing, but the people that put it together are working, they're going to try to work for him. So the thing I actually just read was this paper that anybody who's working in trade should read by a guy named Stephen Mirren, who's the head of Trump's Economic Advisory Council, so he's got some influence. And the argument he's making is around tariffs. And it's again, this is a worldview. If you want to reshape the global trading system, which the US does, they want to achieve a strangely contradictory aim. They want to remain the world's reserve currency, and in fact, they'll punish people that try to change that. But they want to stop paying the price for that. The price you pay for being the world's reserve currency is a currency that's so strong that it makes your exports less attractive, it undermines your own manufacturing base, and they want to do both. And so they're going to use their power in the world, including with us, to change this. And the way you do it is you impose tariffs on a country like Canada in such a way that it weakens our currency at precisely the rate of the tariffs. So from the US point of view, it's not inflationary because their purchasing power goes up. So you impose a tariff on Canada, that good does get more expensive for the US purchaser, but because the Canadian dollar collapses in response, the US dollar buys more of it and it offsets the tariff. So you follow that logic through. This is a very well thought out, if you read this policy paper, these folks aren't messing around, and what they want to do is reshape the trading order. They don't believe in free trade. They believe in America. They believe in the manufacturing base of America. They're not, smoking magic pipes. This is extremely thought out policy. It's not the one that sort of the liberal democratic hegemony has subscribed to for decades, but it's one you have to know about because it's, again, what do you do, Tom, though, when that's the underpinning? So you can go read that and say, okay, let's respond to that. Well, are we responding to that, or are we responding to, and I don't want to be rude, he's a democratic leader of he is who he is, but a sort of toddler-like mentality that will pick and choose from that policy doctrine. So what do you do?
Should have also mentioned when he was talking about McKinley, he also threw out this prize, which is also with McKinley, he made so much from tariffs, they didn't need income tax. So there are some people, can he be serious about this? That the tariffs will be so high, they will get rid of American income tax? And tariffs at the moment produce about 2% of American revenues. So those are major changes if you're actually starting to look at tariffs as a revenue gainer, which was a McKinley policy, which also slightly contradicts, though, the use of tariffs as a policy changer. Okay. So, those are contradictory objectives. But contradictions in this president are in the same paragraph. So as you said, I'm not saying everybody around him doesn't have coherence and intelligence. I know people in the Heritage Foundation and have dealt with them for many, many years. There's some very smart people there, but they do have a worldview. Mm-hmm. And he accepts part of that worldview and then picks pieces from a puzzle, and then he's going to see if they all fit. Right. So what do we do then? And I'm going to get back on some of the questions about Canada as well, but the thought strikes me as this, because Amanda brought a very key point, and our principal raised it in his very first comments today, which is that the Trump approach and the MAGA approach and the new Republican Party, it's not the Republican Party I knew when I taught at Harvard, it's a totally different group of folks. Their worldview is America-centric only. The WTO, the Atchison, Truman, Eisenhower consensus after World War II. We've all marched to that broad consensus, except possibly the North Koreans, but that's under assault from the people who invented it, and that means if there's an assault coming from that front, which is this world of rule by law, lower tariffs, agreements internationally, is now thrown over for America-centric, tariff-led, bash your way into various economies. Those of us, you have to either adapt to it, give in to it, or you try to fight it. And as we talked about this morning, we can't fight it on our own. But if you can put together a worldwide alliance of people who still believe in that consensus, and so that's very close Canadian cooperation and indeed a de facto trade alliance with the EU, with Mexico, with anybody else who agrees to this consensus, which the Trumpites are going against, and that we agree to some coordinated actions. So it's not just Canada putting tariffs on orange juice. We all do. And therefore, then Trump and the Trump followers aren't fighting a Canada-U.S. war. They're fighting a Canada-U.S. war, a Canada-Mexico trade war, a Canada-EU war, and whoever else we can bring in the coalition. Now that calls for Canada to bring together those alliances, or join it if the Brits or the EUs wanted to do it. But a little bit like the Landmines Treaty, we call people together to try to defend this world system. And maybe if Trump had to fight a three-front war, we wouldn't be so front and center in it.
Well, I'm curious in that context what you thought of our leadership throwing Mexico under the bus at the very first opportunity.
Yeah, I was totally opposed to that. I thought that was both terrible substantively. Mexico has been our partner within NAFTA. We're all part of North America. And strategically, again, we need Mexico and Latin America in general as allies. We should be coordinating things with them, not saying chuck them out because they've got a trouble with drug cartels. Yes, they do, and we're affected too, and we've got to move on that. But we move on that with them. We don't start adopting the same mentality, which is beggar thy neighbor. That's what we're fighting.
Agreed. I mean, I agree with all of that, although I think there are a couple of different categories in which Canada could act. And one of them, and we're hearing a lot about this, but are our own internal issues. So first of all, internal free trade. Older than you are the barriers between provinces. Your government didn't fix it, and no government since has fixed it. This is a provincial issue, and maybe this is the moment in our history when we have the will to change it. We're told that it's about the equivalent of what the first batch of tariffs might look like if there were 25% over the course of a couple of years. It's the same hit to GDP as what we would get in a benefit if we got rid of those. So there are things we could do. On the trade side, I mean, you can't help but think about our marketing boards as something we can offer to our trading partners, which is just an eternal irritant. It's why we still don't have a free trade deal with the UK post-Brexit, because we are insistent on protecting a small group of farmers at the cost of many other variables. And maybe that's what we want, but I wish more Canadians were aware that that's what we were doing day in and day out. But the sort of other aspect of this, Tom, that I think is worth talking about is if we're living in a world where what the US wants is to create a manufacturing base, use its strong dollar power to exert its authority over every other country, give up its role as the sort of unifier of all the Bretton Woods agreements, then the question is, there are things Canada could do that are pretty bold. Do we do them, do we get out in front of that? Or do we say, well, this guy might never pull this off and they might actually pull back from all of this, and maybe he's just saying this as a negotiating tactic because he wants something lesser? Or do we say, look, let's actually put Canada first in the same way. Let's stop being a team player. I don't mean abandon our trade partners. But what if, for instance, we said all Canadian commodities will now be priced in Canadian dollars? For sure, critical minerals and all of these new markets that we're developing. That will be expensive. That will be complicated. The first people lining up to say we can't do it will be our own banks, because they have all kinds of systems around US dollar trading. But we can do it, and actually there's a lot of opportunity in building new systems that put the Canadian, and what that does is create, of course, inherent value in the Canadian dollar for everything we produce. Because one of the things I think Donald Trump is going to do first, and I heard in this inaugural speech, and I'm sure you all did, they're taking back auto manufacturing. So this auto pact that has been so important to us may well be more fragile than it's ever been since its inception. What's your thought about doing something bolder and getting in front of something that would be a pretty radical thing for a Canadian government to do?
I think you start off, Amanda, and this is hard to do when you're into a crisis, foreign policy crisis. Some people have called it an existential crisis in dealing with Trump. Very hard to do, but you start off saying, put him aside. What's in our interest? I mean, what should we have done many years ago anyway? And if it happens to coincide with what he wants to help occur, then let him take credit. He's a man who wants to take credit. Let him take the credit. But we should be doing things in our own interest that we should have done before. Now there are points that were raised, and they've been raised by many Canadians, but also in our panels today, and not to reiterate all the things that we talked about this morning, but people have known for a long, long time that being a free rider on defense would come back to bite us. We've had conferences here on this. Hugh Siegel, our former principal, spent much time trying to work on that issue. We've known for a long, long time that the Arctic is an essential part, not only of our identity, but our future riches. And there are real threats there. And yet, as someone said this morning, every announcement about the Arctic is a photo op in a skidoo, and nothing ever happens. Tiny, tiny amounts. Now, those are basic changes. Canadians have had the luxury of ignoring those essential elements, including the internal trade, because we think that the U.S. will bail us out, and it's not worth the political risk. Now, that's where you've got to change, I think. Do what's right, and which there'll be fights. But Amanda's right when we talk about using tariff protection. Now, on milk for Canada, our tariff is 250%. So if McKinley was bad at 47, think of what others look at us at 250, right? So these are things that we can look at and have a package that makes sense for us, and I would get out in front of it, but make it that it's good for the country and not just because we are reacting to Trump.
I want to bring something up that it feels a little bit like the skunk at the garden party, because it's one of those subjects where everyone goes, oh yeah. But this president is going to pull out of Paris, almost certainly.
Yeah.
But regardless, he's going to pull back.
Did it before.
He did it before. He's going to drill, baby, drill. Climate change is one of those issues where you really could get global consensus. You would imagine, I say that, we haven't yet, but I imagine that you could, because the science gets more compelling all the time, that even the people that are reluctant about it have to agree that the science is the science. Is that a place where we could actually get a global coalition to exert pressure on the United States? In other words, on the place where he least wants to negotiate, where he's least interested in paying any mind whatsoever, is that the opportunity for the other members of the G7 at least to get together and say, look, we are aligned on this, and these are the actions we're now going to take? Because at some point soon, we're going to have to see markets pricing in the real risk of climate. And the insurance industry is doing it, and it's doing it in the most ham-fisted way, where the first person paying the price is a property owner. An individual homeowner in California is the front line of that market price risk assessment. And that is A, unfair, and B, bizarre, because not owning a home will not solve climate change. And historically, the insurance industry has been really good at guiding us. They stopped insuring slave ships about 2 decades before slave trading ending. They stopped insuring asbestos production about 9 years before asbestos was deemed illegal. Property owners are not the problem. The place where it will show up with of great horror and pain will be in sovereign debt of all types, especially municipal bonds. What if we could accelerate that? What if we could actually create a global consensus around that and use it as a lever against the US?
Well, Canada has been a follower on global consensus issues really since the Chrétien government. It's very hard to think of any foreign initiative that we have taken on almost any front.
Even on climate?
we haven't been bad on climate, but the Europeans have been ahead of us on
Yes,
that,
yes,
right?
okay.
So I'm talking about where you are a first mover, a real leader on it, and looking at where there's a chance for a global consensus, or large parts of it, where the United States may opt out, but who else will be in it? Those are the areas that I would look at, and climate's absolutely central because that's unites us with the EU, the Nordics, who we should, in my view, be having a northern front within NATO, with Sweden and Finland and ourselves, building that up within that area, working on climate change with the Europeans, seeing whether there are any European investors who may replace the investment issues that we're going to be going through. So the answer is yes, and it's not just that. I would look at areas where it makes sense for us to be part of and even lead. We've been behind on money laundering. Here at Massey, we've had sessions of money laundering a couple of years ago. We've been really slow and terrible on that. These are things I don't understand why. Yeah. But these are legitimate critiques against our country for the lethargy we've shown on these really important issues. So, look at the consensus, get out in front, and invite the United States to join.
Tell me what you think the right approach. I'm going to turn this around on you because you've actually been in the rooms, Tom. Our political.
But I'm supposed to be interviewing you.
No, we're in conversation. This is a conversation.
Yeah.
Because we're in a very interesting time, of course, for a response to anything, because we have not just a federal election looming, but of course a leadership contest inside one of the primary parties. So what should the thought process be, in your view, for those people? And I know what it might be. It'll be political expediency. But what should it be? What should be the conversations that are being had as those races unfold?
Well, this morning, there were various phrases that we're at a turning point, or that this just isn't a normal set of political issues that are arising. In my time, we faced separatism with those referendums, and it wasn't just a Quebec-Ottawa issue. Every province got in. Bill Davis, Robarts took a major leadership role. So did Peter Lougheed. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians came down to Quebec and demonstrated in favor. Bilingualism started, French immersion in our schools. I'm just saying, that was a real big issue. Could have broken up over it. And the country took some macro big steps with huge fights. Bilingualism was very unpopular in my part of the country and so on. But it was done, and a generation later, it worked. We're, in my view, in exactly the same position. Because the United States rejecting the post-war consensus on how the world should be managed in terms of rule of law is one of those seminal points. And those who believe in the rule of law and believe in an international approach to issues have got to come together to try and confront the rogue elephant.
So create a new meeting of...
No, I mean, we have just started. Mr. Trudeau just created, I think, Friday, our Prime Minister's Council of various folks from different walks of life. With the exception of the Premier of Alberta, the Premier's meetings around these issues have been, in my view, quite a good start. I would bring the Premiers into all the major councils on decision-making in dealing with the U.S. A shared federalism that we haven't had in a long time. I'd bring them right in. And in fact, in some cases, I would even delegate the action to this province that you'll take in charge of this. So you would bring it forward in Parliament, in parliamentary committees. You'd actually let MPs have a role. You might even let cabinet members have a role. That would be a change in recent years. So, I mean, there are a host of things that you could do to extend the net while we're in the crisis. And that's what I do. There's a lot of basic decision-making that I would bring others in and share.
But in a global way, there are two strategies that are being kind of kicked around. And one of the more pragmatic is to reinforce our alliance with the U.S., to show them all the ways. And I caught the tail end of the panel previous, but border security is a really interesting one, including, I mean, there are things we could do in this country, I think, that would be beneficial to us, create jobs and value. And border security, and when I say that, I don't mean, you know, stopping people at the Quebec border. I mean ports. I mean our ports are abysmally secured. We could actually digitize, we could create secure trade corridors that don't exist today. We could know what's on cargo ships. There's a thought, I get my car back. You know, there are things that we could do that would be good for us, but the question, and that would of course be an appeasement to the U.S. They want us to be doing those things. We can offer these things that are good for us, but good for them. So in other words, tighten our alliance with them, play along a little bit, or we could turn to the rest of the world and say, hey, Denmark, we should talk. And Europe, what are we gonna do? And actually create meetings and consensus.
And man, it's not either or. I said we start with what's right for us. It's not good for Canada to have Mexican drug cartels making fentanyl in British Columbia. We should be, nothing to do with Trump. We should be working on that one a long time ahead. So there are a whole series of things that still make sense. I would do very little to appease the Trumpites on things that I felt strong about. I would go quite far to do things that they may like, that we should have done a long time ago. Then at the same time, when you know there are things they don't like a real push again around the environment, I would get international coalitions going and invite them to join. So it's kind of a three-pronged strategy.
Tell me what you make of some of the conversation we're hearing now inside Canada are things like, well, we're going to ramp up our critical minerals mining, and we've got, of course, all of the most important, et cetera, which feels to me a bit like when the pilot comes on and says we're going to make up time in the air because we left late. And you think, why don't we always go that speed? Why do we go slow? As though we have been lagging, ragging the puck on critical minerals. We can't get mines built for what? There's a whole host of reasons. Some of them are good, but it's very complex. Do you take that, are we actually going to be better versions of ourselves because we have this existential threat, or is this just empty talk?
If we're smart, we'll be better versions of ourselves. Let me just go back again to the major crisis that preoccupied most of my political life. This is a better country because we're bilingual.
Yes.
We have a better education system because we've got immersion being taught. This is a better country because francophones were brought up out of the.
And thank you for our Constitution, by the way.
Yeah, and a little bit of charter rights came along as well. All of that was a huge response to a big, and we're a better place for it. Yep. Okay, and we didn't just do it to appease René Lévesque and so on. It was done because it was the right thing. It happened to win French Canadians over, but it was done because these were the right things to do. Better for all of us. Approach the new MAGA America in exactly the same way.
Nostalgia is a very dangerous thing, but do we have the leadership today that we had then?
That's another seminar at Massey, I think.
It doesn't feel as though we have the seriousness that we had. I mean, and again, I know we always think, but when I look at the government of my childhood, which, full disclosure, included my dad, it seemed like it was full of people that had, again, going back to Project 2025, the thing I found reassuring about that is when someone has a carefully constructed, unified view of the world, I can buy into that. I might not believe in it, I might not vote for it, but I could certainly subscribe to their right to have it. And if they can eloquently describe it, even better. I don't know that we have that these days.
Let me go back to one background point on that then, because this is a larger, same framework about doing what's right for the country. Well, what's gone wrong with our political system? It's gone wrong because it's got so centralized, and I'm one who ran a centralized office. So we were a part of that transition, but a small part. Today we have the PMO telling a minister who should be their chief of staff. If I'd gone into Alan McEachin and saying, by the way, I've got a chief of staff for you, would have kicked me out of the room. We have the PMO in caucus. meetings, which is the one time where MPs have a chance to really talk to the PM. They often complain about the PM. I mean, that's their chance to shine. They've done the heavy lifting of getting elected. We've got appointed people there. We've taken the partisanship of the House of Commons, we've moved to committees. I can't speak to other parties, we've got Jamie and others here, but in my party, we've taken the role of members and we turned it into a Peronist movement, where there's no commitment to the Liberal Party whatsoever. And the checks and balances within the party have been all dismantled. We don't have regional ministers, who are another source of countervail to the PM. There's so many elements that we've diminished good people running for office, let alone the problems with social, but good people running for office, that's one reason why perhaps the caliber of leadership isn't what we would hope for, because we've made it really difficult for good people to run.
Here, here.
So, and then we should open it up for a
Yes.
couple of questions from the crowd. So,
Absolutely.
okay. Questions, sir?
So,
Oh, just wait for my
sure.
Did you go?
Thank you. So the previous panel discussed the issue of entrepreneurs, Canadian entrepreneurs, businesses moving south to the border as soon as they're established. My question is for both of you, but also specifically Ms. Lang, 'cause I read your book, The Power of Why. I'm a big fan. What do you think Canada should do to create a more welcoming business environment, and which would help offset some of the Trump instability?
I think, we don't have time to do this justice, honestly, because I could use all the remaining time we have and still not have enough to say on this. But the short answer is, I think, one of culture. Actually, it's a horrible answer because it's vague and it's hard to write policy to this. We've done everything right. And we do have, as we all know, we have entrepreneurs, we have innovators, we start businesses at the rate that's as fast as any country on the planet. And to your point, some of them, not all of them, but some of them leave at a certain moment in time. There's a really good paper that the Bank of Canada just put out that's worth reading, and the title has the word distributive in it. It's a distributive analysis of Canada versus US GDP and productivity. Super fun title. But the point that they make is our productivity problem is completely taken up by the top 10% income earners of our country. If you strip them out, the bottom 90% are as productive as Americans. There's no gap. Let that sink in, because we talk a lot about this, and most workers are like, "Oh, we got to be more productive." No, you don't. And then the paper says, "Well, what's that about?" And what they're suggesting is it's because we lose a few, and it only takes a few of our most innovative, productive entrepreneurs and high-performing people to the U.S. And the externalities around such a person are such that it actually diminishes the whole country. So then you read this paper and you think, okay, well, if that's true, to your point earlier, you always want to say, well, what do we do about it? Otherwise, it's just observing a problem, interestingly. And honestly, the answer is a cultural one. We have to celebrate business. We are a country that tends towards the anti-business. We tend towards thinking profit is shameful and something to hide away. We've heard business leaders talk about this before. We now have political leadership that's unafraid to be anti-business, and I find that personally shocking. It's what will make all of us better and wealthier and happier and create the answers for tomorrow. So that's it. Culture is the answer.
Another question here.
The mic's over there.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Tom. Great conversation. We have a G7 coming up in literally a few months, and Canada is the host nation. So hosts get to choose the signature issue. Given what's going on, that we'll probably have a new prime minister of one of the parties and this presidential choice in the U.S., what do you think the issue should be, the signature issue that Canada can most influence as host nation?
Well, we better have the framework on how to deal with the United States firmly in mind, and then that's a wonderful occasion to get the kind of international consensus I'm talking about worked on there. And so there's been, even in public opinion, a retreat around environmental issues, and I'm not wedded necessarily to the carbon tax per se. There are other ways to try to take carbon out of the system. But
Such as?
Cap and trade.
Okay.
Okay?
It's still a price on carbon, though.
I know, but
Okay.
it doesn't
Potato,
lose,
potato.
It doesn't lose me votes. So
Fair enough.
the Liberal
There's
Party
no, but
picked
let's not
on a
back
great
away
issue.
from Tom.
Okay.
Let's not be publicly backing away from a price on carbon being the single best way to reduce carbon.
Yes, and there are
But we can get
political
yes.
mechanics that could have been a touch better. But that would be one. And we haven't mentioned this much yet today, but probably by then we'll see what the American administration does with Russia on Ukraine. We may need to really step up, the Europeans, ourselves, and everybody else, to try to fill that gap on Ukraine.
I mean, it depends, I guess, how aggressive we want to be at the G7. Sort of global trade could be a theme, and the importance, but frankly, the importance of borders could be a theme. Greenland is going to need some backup. Panama is going to need some backup. I don't think we're going to see Americans invading our borders, but what happens in Ukraine may well set the tone for what we allow elsewhere.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I see our next panels at the back of the room, not the back of the bus, but the back of the room. And there we're going to take this tremendous amount of political experience and insight to help answer these questions. So we were just getting into the conversation with Amanda. I'm so delighted that you could join us. And I should mention as well, for those who don't know, Amanda has been the chair for many years for Covenant House, which deals with the homeless and at-risk youth. And my colleague, Don Gibson, is talking about a session on the homeless here at Massey in March. So we might have you back.
I'm past chair, but definitely
Past chair,
go
okay.
Covenant House. Yes.
Thank you
Tom.
very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Amanda. It was great.
Thanks, all.